Good evening. Welcome to Alvernia University's Search for Social Justice Everywhere series. This is the second presentation in our series. Before we begin, I would like to ask everyone to mute your microphones for the entirety of the lecture. And after the lecture, which will be approximately 40 minutes long, there will be time for discussion, ample discussion time, about 45 minutes. In order to ensure that everything goes smoothly with respect to our virtual format, please use your hand feature at the bottom of the screen. And if you'd like to pose a question or engage our guest in discussion, I'll be moderating the session and indicate the order of questions by calling your name or screen name rather. And at that time, you may unmute yourself to begin and enter in discussion. So let's begin. So again, welcome. My name is Dr. Janae Schultz, and I will be the host for tonight's event. I would like to welcome everyone to our second lecture in our Search for Racial Justice Everywhere series. This series is part of a carefully organized, comprehensive first-year experience in which we strive to introduce our new Alvernia students to the value of the liberal arts as the foundation out of which one pursues a particular vocation and thrives in one's community. To impart the importance of being ethical, well-rounded citizens, and of course, to introduce them to the ethos of our university, grounded as it is in our Franciscan mission and the values of humility, service, contemplation, peacemaking, and collegiality. In keeping with our tradition of providing a meaningful first-year experience that introduces students to our mission of producing ethical leaders with moral courage who aspire to academic excellence and develop a strong commitment to social justice and equity, Alvernia University Search Program, with the support of the Holleran Center for Community and Global Engagement, has organized this speaker series in a way that highlights the contribution of scholars whose work and message correspond with the Search seminar theme for the year. That theme is racial justice, an issue that has rocked our nation and is absolutely crucial for the future betterment of our society and possibility of moving to a more just and equitable existence. The importance of justice is paramount, and we must remind ourselves that peace without justice is complacency. Tonight, we are honored to host Dr. Amber Pabon, who will help us develop a deeper understanding about issues related to racial justice, equality, and the importance of diversity in the educational context and for diversifying our educational methods. Immediately following the lecture, Dr. Pabon will be joined by representatives from various groups committed to social and racial justice from our own Alvernia community, such as the Justice, Equity, and Inclusion Council and the Faculty Council's Social Justice Advocacy Committee, as well as participants from the faculty learning community on racial justice for further discussion and questions. We also invite all of you who are here with us tonight to participate and share your thoughts and comments on these important themes that we anticipate from Dr. Pabon's lecture. We hope that this model of conference style participation will generate the kind of deeply rewarding scholarly discussion that inspires our students and community to take up and deepen their understanding of the grave issues our nation faces, as well as foster a sense of hope and desire to participate as caretakers of our democracy. We have structured this year's event so that it can be an enriching experience, while at the same time keeping our students, faculty, and staff safe. Therefore, this lecture and the ensuing discussion will be recorded and provided to Search faculty to incorporate into their classroom curriculum so that all freshman students may benefit from this enriching opportunity. I want to thank everyone in advance for sharing their time and attention with us tonight. And now I would like to welcome Dr. Amber Pabon to our university. Dr. Amber Pabon is assistant professor in the College of Education, Secondary Education Department, and coordinator of the Masters of Education Initial Certification Program at Kutztown University. Dr. Pabon is an alum of the University of California, Los Angeles, with a Bachelor's of Art degree in Sociocultural Anthropology. She earned her master's in English education from the City University, New York, Brooklyn. Dr. Pabon began her career teaching secondary social studies, reading, and English language arts in Brooklyn, New York, with the New York City Department of Education. After additional professional development at Columbia University's Teachers College Reading and Writing Project, she continued working with the New York City Department of Education in the role of literacy staff developer at her school, supporting a staff of more than 70 teachers. After nearly a decade in public education, Dr. Pabon pursued and earned her doctorate in urban education from the CUNY Graduate Center. Her dissertation, Schooled Out: Black Male Teachers' Experiences Schooling in, Teaching, and Leaving New York City Public Schools, focuses on the challenges of institutionalized race and gendered oppression in Black male urban school educators' lives. In addition to her commitment and efforts in strengthening and diversifying teacher education in the College of Education, Dr. Pabon continues to develop her qualitative research strands on life histories of Black teachers and socially just ontologies in practices in teacher preparation. Dr. Pabon has written several important articles and publications, such as Can We Say the R Word? Identifying and Disrupting Colorblind Epistemologies in a Teacher Education Methods course, which was published in the Journal of the American Educational Studies Association. Waiting for Black Superman, a look at a problematic assumption, published in Urban Studies, and Becoming a Critical English Teacher Educator When Black Lives Matter, a chapter in her forthcoming book. Her presentation tonight is drawn from her current research and provides a poignant view into the history and struggles that young people of color have faced in striving for success and recognition. Dr. Pabon's lecture is entitled From the Soil to the Sun to the Schoolhouse, a Black woman educator's process of learning her life history through critical ethnoquilting. Thank you, Dr. Pabon, for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to set up technologically, so just bear with me. I believe that that's correct. Okay, thank you all. So good evening, and thank you, Dr. Schultz, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to Alvernia University, the Search First Year Experience, and the Holleran Center for Community and Global Engagement for sponsoring this event. And thank you to all these people who are here. This is so exciting. I am honored, truly honored to be here. So Dr. Schultz actually shared a little bit of what I wanted to start with tonight, but I love it. So I'll begin my talk actually backing up a little bit and share with you somewhat about my background. My family is originally from the southern United States, including Arkansas and Mississippi, but migrated to Los Angeles, California during the Great Migration in the 1940s. I grew up in Los Angeles and studied, as Dr. Schultz said, sociocultural anthropology as an undergraduate at the University of California, Los Angeles. Go UCLA. I then moved to Brooklyn, New York, and began my career in education as a secondary English teacher in high poverty urban schools. While teaching was among the most rewarding experiences in my professional life, after nearly a decade in public education, I wondered how to make a more considerable impact on improving the schooling inequalities for the predominantly Black and Latinx youth I taught. My questions about a more socially just and equitable public education system led me to doctoral study at the City University of New York, or CUNY, Graduate Center in the Urban Education Department. My dissertation focused on the schooling and teaching experiences of Black male teachers in urban contexts. This study led to a series of publications, all focusing on the men who shared their life histories with me, and all published while I was a newly minted assistant professor of teacher education. I've continued my work preparing and developing teachers at Kutztown University of Pennsylvania's College of Education, which actually offers a familiar sense of fulfillment, like I experienced nearly 20 years ago when I began my teaching career. I have also simultaneously experienced a growing intellectual curiosity that has led me back to my roots in sociocultural anthropology and life history research. I want to pause here and acknowledge that I've shared a few terms thus far that may be familiar to some and unfamiliar to others. So I want to clarify for everyone their meanings and the meanings that I employ before moving on. So the first term, social justice, we use this term a lot. And I draw from Sensoy and D'Angelo's definition of actually critical social justice, which is the concept that society is stratified along group lines, including race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. And advocates of social justice seek to change inequalities deeply embedded in the fabric of society. Life history research is a qualitative methodology focused on accessing the experiences of an individual across a period of time from their own perspective and voice relative to historical and social contexts. Sociocultural anthropology is a field of study focused on the social and cultural dimensions of people, as well as descriptions and analyses of their histories. Researchers often seek to better understand practices and traditions among a group of people, and one tangible outcome of this line of research is the ethnography. And finally, autoethnography. While ethnography is the study of the cultural characteristics of a group of people, autoethnography is the study of the self. In order to respond to the question that Sherrick Hughes asks so eloquently, what am I learning by examining my identities, power, privileges, and penalties within cultural contexts? Okay, so now that we're clear on terminology, I'll return to the focus of my talk, which is my most recent project in which I have engaged in an autoethnographic turn in my scholarship to examine my own origins and journey as a Black woman educator. So tonight I share just a snapshot of this research project that emerged from two questions that I have been grappling with for the past 20 years. Who are my people? And why have I been called to teach? To be clear, I recognize my privilege as I grew up in a middle-class nuclear family with my mom and dad and younger brother. My aunt and uncle and grandparents also played a significant role in my upbringing. However, I also see the disadvantages of knowing little about my family origins as the descendants of enslaved people of African descent. Like other US Blacks, Heather Andrea Williams writes in her book, Help Me to Find My People, The African American Search for Family Lost in Slavery. Today, long after there's any chance that actual people can be found, descendants who did not know them, who only know that they must have existed, a grandmother must have had a grandmother, a father must have had a grandfather, take up the search, hoping to find traces of their ancestors in the documents that individuals and institutions leave behind. These descendants, removed from the palpable and direct loss of those who lived during slavery can still be haunted by the need to know, the desire to find out about those who were lost through sale or through negligence of history. And I'll back up a little bit there. Like Williams articulates, I have yearned to better understand the lives of even my most recent ancestors, like my great-grandparents and their parents. I am but a leaf seeking to connect to my family tree with roots in West Africa and the Southern United States. So to answer my first question, who are my people? I began my inquiry by collecting artifacts, including photographs and obituaries, to reconstruct my family tree. I also began documenting family members' oral stories based on their recollections of our family genealogy. Engaging in interviews of my grandmother, mother, and second cousin helped me specifically learn more about my great-grandmother in particular, Charlie, as family members had shared that she was also a public school teacher in her native Arkansas. And finally, I reviewed recently released archival data through projects sponsored by the Smithsonian and the National Archives. After triangulating all of this information, I was then able to confirm many aspects of Charlie's life history. And I call this methodological approach critical ethnoquilting. Like the African-American tradition of quilt making, I engaged in the process of stitching together pieces of information to craft a narrative, albeit patchwork, of Charlie's life. Her life history is an example of the possibilities of critical ethnoquilting, a term that I intentionally employ to recognize the historical significance of African-American quilt making to its roots in chattel slavery. Among African-American in particular, quilt making has been an act of mobilization and emancipation and a space to express challenging personal histories and forge kinship relationships. Quilt making aligns with Black women's ways of knowing and knowledge creation, including the centering of ethics of care, the practice of empathy, and assuming responsibility and accountability for the community's good, or other mothering. Extended further, critical ethnoquilting is a tool theoretically grounded in critical race feminism for the purpose in aiding the crafting of counter-narratives that focus on Black women's intersectional identities and experiences with heteropatriarchy and racism. In the tradition of other scholars, including Vanessa Siddle Walker, Michelle Foster, and Gloria Ladson Billings, I maintain that centering the lives of Black women teachers addresses the social imperative of naming, documenting, and sharing how they navigate, negotiate, resist, and or succumb to gender and racial oppression in educational contexts. Furthermore, I posit that in conjunction with life history interviews, critical ethnoquilting can help us confirm the existence of people who previously existed only in family memory and faded pictures. So I'll share just a quick glimpse of critical race feminism, and I imagine that we might discuss this further after my talk. So here I'm suggesting that this methodological tool can be useful to other qualitative researchers committed to centering the experiential knowledges of people of color and supplanting ahistorical, decontextualized analyses with counter narratives. So I want to share what I learned, and this is just an excerpt from Charlie's life history, and as an example of the possibilities of critical ethnoquilting. Her life history Charlie Jackson was born in Pine Bluffs, Arkansas in 1897. She was the child of Rosie Perkins and Rosie's enslaver, and was raised on his slave labor camp with her two brothers, O.C. and Leo. And I just want to say that I knew Charlie, O.C. and Leo and remember them very fondly. It is unknown exactly what circumstances led to this arrangement of them living on this slave labor camp, but still Rosie, Charlie's mother, raised her children in her own dwelling on this property and sent Charlie to private schooling. This was highly unusual for several reasons. At the turn of the century, Pine Bluffs, Arkansas was a racially violent town with public lynchings taking place on a frequent basis and few opportunities beyond sharecropping for Black folks. Second, the US education system was in its infancy, and only about 53% of white school-age children attended school, and less than 30% of Black children earned any education whatsoever. Charlie did go to primary school and was then awarded a scholarship to continue her education at historically Black college and university, Rust University in Mississippi, which, if you could see the map closely, is actually just down the water. She earned the equivalent of a high school education and her teaching credentials. In 1919, Charlie returned to Arkansas, where she married David Nelson and taught in the public school system for several years. From this union, 11 children were born, but around 1938, David passed away and Charlie was thrust into financial crisis. At age 43, she took on extra work, clearing logs from the local river. Eventually, as a widow, raising children alone in the context of racial violence, Charlie sought to protect her family's well-being by fleeing the Jim Crow South. In 1940, she purchased train tickets for herself and her children and headed to Southern California, where her brothers O.C. and Leo had already relocated and gained employment with the city of Los Angeles. When Charlie and her children arrived, they settled in South Central, right off of Central Avenue, which was a booming Black ethnic enclave. And Charlie sought employment as a teacher from the city school board. However, when she applied for a position, she was told that despite her degree, she was not adequately qualified to teach and was refused a job. Charlie thus spent her remaining years working as a housemaid, teaching Sunday school at her local Church of God in Christ, and raising her surviving children. And one of those children was my grandmother, Hazel Jean, who begat my mother, Kay, who bore me. And nearly 60 years later, in 2001, Charlie's Los Angeles dream deferred was realized through me when I entered the field of education as a public school teacher in New York City. So why do I share Charlie's story for all? What relevance does it have for your lives? Well, Foremost, I share her story publicly as an act of healing. And y'all can see that's like emotional, even saying these words out loud, right? Like other people of African descent, my genealogy is incomplete. And so connecting with my ancestors using this methodology has grounded me to my roots, enabling me to answer, to some extent, my initial questions. Who are my people? Furthermore, as an act of social justice, I share her story to talk back to invisibility, making visible the material conditions of racism and discrimination surrounding one Black woman's childhood, schooling, and teaching experiences. Knowing the life histories of marginalized folks provides us with opportunities to correct the historical narrative that, in the case of Black women teachers, has under-recognized our impact in education, including our contributions to educational theory, practice, and even teachers' rights. By reconstructing our life histories through critical ethnoquilting, we can construct counter narratives to supplant our invisibility. So this project adds to the existing body of literature on the life histories of Black women teachers. And that's Charlie, and that's me. Second, I share to convey how critical ethnoquilting enabled me to answer my second question: why was I called to teach? And this question was actually posed initially to me in an assignment in my teacher education program at Brooklyn College. At the time, my thinking about my career choice was much more pragmatic than it is now. I entered the field during a citywide teacher shortage, and the school board accepted me as a non-education major and provided emergency credentials. And the irony is not lost that I was able to get a position, but Charlie was not, even though she was more credentialed than I was. My degree in sociocultural anthropology was deemed sufficient to teach social studies, with the caveat that I earn an educational master's degree and certification within 3 years. These requirements did not dissuade me at all. I needed a job and I needed to earn a living as a new college graduate with a degree that I did not see as having a direct pipeline into a specific career. And now I know that it did. Navigating the logistics of the onboarding process and preparing for the classrooms was at the center of my thinking. My larger purpose in becoming a teacher was in the periphery. It was not until I started working with young people in those Brooklyn classrooms that I began to imagine teaching as a calling. My moments of joy include our young adult literature book clubs, or publishing day and writing workshop, or the daily ciphers where my students would rhyme and tap on their desks. Class field trips to art museums across New York City. Those were beautiful times, but we also experienced challenges, and these included working for me, working to advocate for and alongside students against zero tolerance punishment policies, supporting young people experiencing trauma, and negotiating the double bind of high standards tests. Still, even the most taxing days were often peppered with laughter or happy tears or inside jokes in our classroom. As I look back on my journey, I now understand that I became a teacher when I finally understood that my role was more significant than teaching reading, writing, and maintaining classroom management. I became a teacher when I learned to listen to young folks with more compassion than judgment. I became a teacher when I was vulnerable enough to admit that I had made a mistake, or was stumped by a question, or could apologize when I was wrong. when the students demonstrated that they had learned something in our class, or felt safe and cared for, or believed that I believed in their greatness and expected their best, I became a teacher. And it would be several years later when I entered doctoral study and learned that much of what I just described, including ethic of care, critical cultural consciousness, culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, warm demander pedagogy, or community nomination, had been studied and named and written about by Black women scholars about the teaching practices of Black women teachers. To be clear, by no means was I ever the perfect teacher. And in fact, no one is. But I have a few anecdotes and I have some artifacts and quite a few interviews that are the pieces of my own critical ethnoquilt. So, a call to action. In closing, I want to leave you with a final word about the significance of life history research. For me, listening to and creating life histories is stimulating and healing. Not only do I feel the collective pain of histories lost as an African-American woman, but I also carried a sense of urgency to connect with my ancestor Charlie's story to better understand my purpose. Her life history is a reminder of a Black woman's agency in the context of societal and familial suffering. Her life history is a source of strength that is central to my growth as a teacher, educator, and social justice advocate. Her life history and my connection to it bring personal and cultural affirmation that recharges my spirit in the midst of both a racial and a health pandemic. It's my hope that my talk today has inspired you in ways that are personally or professionally relevant. And so I have some suggestions, sort of a call to action. And they begin with asking you to consider, who are your people? Why are you called to do what you do? How do you engage in your daily life with social justice? And finally, in what ways might you engage with the life histories of marginalized people that perhaps were crafted out of critical ethnoquilts? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pabon. So I think we are now, yes, thank you. Wow. It's really inspiring. Can I be, we're sure that we are no longer sharing screen? Yes?
Yep.
Okay, great. I'm really moved, and I think that probably quite a few of us in the audience are moved as well. I almost think that maybe just sort of taking a moment to take that all in is in order. What I would like to do at this point is open our discussion and the event to to further discussion. And I know that Scott Davidson has been, is going to help me with the moderating role and help me to figure out if there are people in the audience who have questions or who have raised their hands, or if there's been any chat in the chat room.
Okay. Right now, there is no chat in the chat room. However, I would encourage people, please feel free to offer your comments in the chat room. If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them there. Or you could also use the raise your hand feature in the participants area, and then we'll try to get to everybody.
So actually, Dr. Pabon, I'll start us off. And actually, as this may be, partly my own proclivity, because I'm also deeply committed to both feminism and critical race feminism, as you have as you have coined it. So I'm going to ask a question that actually circles us back to that element of your talk at the beginning. And I think that it's just more, this gives you an opportunity to say even more about how the narrative tradition and how you've developed the ethnoquilting from that, how it relates back to what you do in the classroom and the experiences and the strategies that you use. So you say, as you say, your grounding in critical race feminism has led you to pursue your research in a particular matter, and namely, your presentation focuses on narrative as a means of engaging larger frameworks even. So not just this individual histories, but then drawing from that even a greater understanding of what's left out of our common history, which is, I think, hugely powerful, and the deep structures of racism and sexism in society from that. I'd like maybe just, if you wouldn't mind, would you say a little bit more about this tradition and its importance for women of color? And because I think, you did touch on several names that I know. But I know that the audience may be, edified and happy to hear even more about that tradition of Black women and Black feminism that this comes from.
Thank you. Yes, that's a great question. So I'll start by saying, and I hope I conveyed this, that I talk to my students about critical humility, and what I mean by that is the not knowing and being humble in that. And so I, can discuss critical race feminism, or CRF, as I just say, to say it fast. But I didn't know that I was doing this work until after I'd engaged with scholars like Derek Bell, Matsuda, Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Alice Walker. I didn't know that there was a theoretical framework that captured the ways that we might engage in inquiry around gender and racial oppression. I didn't understand that this existed as a lens. So I have, snapshots of experiences or anecdotes from my life that I can look back and say, as Bell Hooks would say, well, that was white supremacist heteropatriarchy, right? But I didn't understand those things until pursuing doctoral study, and in particular, conducting or working alongside with Black men in my dissertation in life history studies. So here's this also like sort of complexity that it took being an outsider across gender lines, right? Even though the participants or the men that I work with, not necessarily participants, were also Black, to sort of understand the distinctions like between critical race theory and critical race feminism, right? So I think that Kimberly Crenshaw's work around intersectionality became much more clear to me as like the missing piece, right? In terms of understanding how the convergence of our social identities, including gender and sexual identity and socioeconomic status alongside race, influence our access and location in relation to forms of institutional power. So the tenets of I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Am I answering? Am I
You
answering?
are, you are. I was just, I mean, I'm just struck by the thing that you started with, the idea of critical humility. And then it just, everything that you're saying, it really highlights the fact that you found your people even in theory. And partly, I think it's a call to those of us who are listening to really realize that there's a voice of those who have not been heard, or who have been outside, or who have been marginalized, which actually really needs to be listened to. And that's a kind of humility that I think is necessary as at least what I'm hearing as an audience member as well.
We have a question from the audience. Carla, would you like to ask your question, please?
Hi, I'm Carla Mannix, and I'm teaching an education course here, the ESL for teachers. So I have young sophomore teachers here, and there's a chapter in the book called Culturally Responsive Teaching. And I'm curious, I've not heard of critical ethnoquilting, or only introduced to critical race feminist theory long time ago. So I'm curious, have you been involved in the development of culturally responsive teaching, or the evolution of it away from multiculturalism and social justice teaching as presented by Zaretta Hammond?
So, no. I wish I could say, right, that I was a part of the sort of the scholarly community that developed that work. That's a little bit before even I started teaching. So if we think about like Gloria Ladson-Billings' Dream Keepers, I have my reference page here that I'm happy to share with folks as well. I think that actually might be valuable. That was written long before I think I was still in undergrad at the time. So culturally relevant teaching, culturally responsive teaching, and then we're also thinking about like Django Paris's culturally sustaining pedagogies as well. And so I think that here again, that some of the practices that I engaged in my classroom with students, emerged out of, making something out of nothing. I didn't know what I was doing. I was also, I'm naming my identity here. Like, I'm a privileged Black girl from Los Angeles who came to live in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, right? Now, is my family a few steps away from poverty? Absolutely. But not like the poverty that the students, like the students whom I taught at all, right? It's a different pathway. Something happened. That's why Charlie's story is like so important and troubling, right? And I don't want to romanticize at all the financial benefits that had to have taken place for her to become educated, right? So that then she could raise her children and for them to all be educated. So all of my great aunts and uncles and grandmother, like these folks were middle-class folks. And so I just want to like sort of highlight that detail. So in my teacher education work is the time where I became sort of more exposed to, hey, there's a whole body of literature, like there's a whole body of scholarship about this stuff, and people have named this already. However, critical ethnoquilting is my term. So this is where I am not going to engage in humility. I did design that, and I have been, as I said, this has been a 20-year question, and I credit two people, and I don't know if they're on the call, but maybe somebody that they know is. So Dr. Florence and Dr. Haroon Kareem were mentors at Brooklyn College who were a part of that project, that initial project that sort of got me to thinking about why was I called to teach and doing that examination. I'll say one more thing about this question. I had to learn from my students. Like, I had no idea how to do life in New York City or in Brooklyn. And so all the things that, all these sort of notions around that we can enter into classrooms with, like even as saviors, right? That had to be completely disrupted and thrown out of the window because my students were schooling me, absolutely, my first year in the classroom. So it took like a year, 2 years, 3 years of gaining that trust, developing relationships, more listening and less talking, working with parents, changing the way that we did parent-teacher conferences, right? To create spaces where parents wanted to come into the school or where we meet halfway. I lived in the community where I taught. I mean, again, these are like things that just took place. And then I learned subsequently that like these were aligned with practices that, you know, my senior scholars had identified, you know, in their research. So I hope that answers your question. Okay.
So we have a couple questions now, and we have, next is Dr. Erin Way. And then after Dr. Way, we have Dr. Cynthia Corbin.
Welcome. Thank you so much for talking. For joining us. Sorry, my 3-year-old has also joined us. My question to you was, my background is in psychology, and one of the things that we have seen in the field of psychology is that, particularly here in the United States, it's a very westernized. Mommy, can hear it. Just a minute. Westernized textbook, right? And the way that we teach it is very white, Eurocentric. And not until women kind of joined psychology for a number of decades did we start to see some of the topics that women saw as important entering into the field of valid scholarship. So, you know, how do you think your scholarship can change the fields that you touch, maybe even the fields of education and pedagogy, so that we start to see some of these things as valid areas of scholarly pursuit?
So yeah, thank you for that question. So one of the aspects of Black feminist thought, right, is centering and respecting the knowledge production of Black women, right? So somewhere along the way in my career, I remember being frustrated by perspectives by not having a seat at the table. I guess that's the best way to say it. By thinking that I, in my scholarship, needed to argue or be in conversation with folks, or let's just say let's depersonalize it. Let's just say frameworks that were antithetical, right? That did not validate. People can say, well, qualitative research, what is that? Or life history research, well, that's not real research. Sort of all of that kind of conversation. But again, my mentors, my elders, right, tapped me on the shoulder and said, well, if you spend all your time arguing with those people, then you'll never get your work done. You'll never live in your purpose. So while it is my hope and desire that, and there's evidence of more visibility among people of color, Black women scholars in educational courses, right? Or utilize as sources. One of the things I intentionally do in my syllabus is be inclusive of folks of color, right? So I have like changed the landscape. Like we don't have to every semester go back to Dewey and Piaget. Like we can use other folks like W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, right? So I guess I share that to say that my answer is like I ask for others to read, right? And to engage with the work. Like that's a part of the call. Like here's this whole conversation and here's this whole body of work that I entered into and standing on the shoulders of giants. And they sort of that work and their affirmations, and then furthermore engaging in this most recent project has made me pivot, even more substantially, because there's a whole body of work. And if folks choose to ignore, right, all of this work, then that's up to them. But I think like this summer, right, is a very great example. It's a tragic example, pardon me, of what happens when we don't pay attention to this work, right? Derek Bell's critical race theory, that's from 1992. Matsuda from 1991. Mm-hmm. But we've been denying that racism exists in the United States. So, and then we see the outcomes in this moment right now. So one of the beautiful things that I saw taking place was Dr. Bettina Love's book, being sold out, right? You couldn't get a copy.
Which book was that for? Do you know the title for everyone?
It's in my references. So
okay.
I'm gonna give it to everybody.
Okay.
So like seeing this Black woman scholar does amazing work around anti-racism, like people running to the shelves and making sure and buying that book so they can get woke, right? I mean, we kind of we produce the work and I know that that it is being utilized and it is being employed, and it may take time for an idea to trickle down. That's okay with me, right? Like I think I understand my social location, and I know that the work is grounded in valid theoretical premises and practices, and I'm doing good enough research.
So I think that just the idea of the necessity of understanding social location is something that has been bestowed on us. And I want to say it positively in an optimistic way. Black feminists thought it has trickled down to some extent, and it is a model that is being taken up, not enough, but I have hope. I mean, I think it's changed the field of feminist theory indelibly. There's no doubt about it. You can't do feminist theory any longer without acknowledging the contributions and the reality that it's just the right thing to do, to listen to and to understand one's social location and to speak from that. So I want to be optimistic about that. But let's go to our next contributor, participant. It's Dr. Cynthia Corbin. You have to unmute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Dr. Schultz and Dr. Paban. I'm thoroughly enjoying this disclaimer. I first need to qualify that Dr. Corbin does not yet have her doctorate. So I just want that to be clear. That's okay, but I just wanted to not to perpetrate during during the process. But Dr. Pabon, I find with this work, and certainly over the summer, when we do it, how the difficulty is often with us being able to face and acknowledge to ourselves what we have repressed through the process so much because of our socialization, because of the society that we live in, the fact that patriarchy and racism and all of those things really have us at a place where it's almost difficult to continue to do the work. And while I've done a lot of this work, I like your term about the humility. If we approach it right, there's so much more to learn and so much we don't know. And as lifelong learners, we always have to be prepared for that. But I found this summer with just everything that erupted, and as you said, it's a tragic opportunity, that it reconnected me with some of my teachings as a child, to not to focus on it and to move on. Not to address it so that you can get through your day sometimes, and not operate in upset and anger, and strive for the goal of your excellent work. And can you talk a little bit about that, dealing with how we look at that? I mean, and I've how shall I say, sit in a circle of those who are aware of those things, so there's support. But when we approach that work, sometimes, just as you became very tearful in talking about the experience of your family and your grandmother and your, being able to do that and approach the work and be prepared and understand that it is very normal when we peel back more of the onion, that it is more difficult, but more valuable. Because as you said, I love your term ethnoquilting. I'm going to use it. Your ears will be burning this week, because I have an assignment that students are finishing up just about that, looking into family, going deeper and why, just to help everybody be prepared and know that it is difficult, but it's the good difficult. It's like you call when you, exercise or you do anything, the good pain. It's good when new muscles are talking to you that didn't before. And so there'll be some of those other issues and feeling as we deal with our own privilege, as we deal with what we have been through, our families have been through, just so that we're all prepared and we know it is hard work. Can you just share a little bit more about that? Because we are dealing with that. Everybody's dealing with that, but we certainly at Alvernia are dealing with that and embarking on it in a different way.
So I want to make sure. So I love what you just said about difficult work and using the word good. And I'm reminded of Good Trouble.
Absolutely.
Yeah, when you said that. So I just want to clarify. Is the question like how do we sustain those of us who are engaged in this work? How do we sustain the work?
It's how we sustain it, but it's also how we even going into it and deciding to, if you will, get in that good trouble, deciding to address it, we will deal with some of our own hidden feelings about it. Why am I bringing this up? Look at, I'm doing well. Why do I want to go in here and create a problem and cause an issue, as well as when we do and embrace it, it is difficult, and we need to kind of almost be ready for the fight, ready for the battle.
I thank you for your question. As I mentioned, that this question of who are my people and why am I a teacher, right, has been sitting with me for a long time. And what resonates with what you said, what resonates with me is like thinking about the lessons that you learned as a child. So I'm now recalling being with not Charlie, but my grandmother, Jean, who's passed away now. And sort of like all of the isms that I learned, that I found myself repeating, as a classroom teacher. And when I say isms, I mean, make sure you have your jacket on before you go outside, right? Like make sure you cover up, like all of these sort of this other mothering, right? That I experienced and then took on that work myself. So I think that a part of this project, or what has enabled me to get here, is actually like I couldn't go on if I didn't, right? It's actually the inverse. Like if I didn't do this, like I needed this study to continue to cope and survive.
Absolutely.
Right? I needed to draw from this strength. I needed Charlie's lessons, right? To be a better mother, right? Myself to my own daughter, to be a better chair researcher to the students who are pursuing doctorates that I teach. Like I needed to find these pieces of myself to be more grounded, right, in my purpose. So I don't think I had a choice, right? I had to go back and get it. But I will say that the pandemic also created an opportunity to be sheltered from everyday racism and everyday patriarchy. So those microaggressions that we experience as a Black woman, well, they kind of stopped, right? When we were shut in the house. Now, things still emerge via email, things still emerge via our Zoom meetings. But for the most part, the stairs when you get on the elevator, well, ain't nobody getting on the elevator, right? The clutching the purse or walking across the street, the pretending that you don't exist. And I'm 6 feet tall, so you can't pretend they don't exist, right? But it happens all the time. Like I'm invisible, and I'm not personalizing this. I'm using these as examples, right? So we can look at ability studies to sort of further examine these questions around the body. So I think I think that was like one sort of protective factor. Another thing was that I have been engaged in a community, in a group of scholars of other Black women writers, and they have pushed me and challenged me and encouraged and prayed over me, like all of these ways that we might sit down and make a quilt, right? To do this relative to our research. So that has been a communal relationship that has been perhaps the most generative experience since my dissertation and working with, my committee and the folks that I went to grad school with. That's the only thing I can compare it to. So I now understand better why folks like James Baldwin got out of the United States, right, and went to live in France, right?
Right.
Because there is a need at times to escape. And so, one unintended consequence of a horrible event vis-a-vis the pandemic was a covering, a sheltering. And then again, this relationship with other women scholars.
Thank you.
So, I have a couple more questions. I don't mean to cut anybody off. I didn't do
Oh,
that.
no, I'm done.
Okay. So I do have some a list that started, which is wonderful to have a fecund discussion. And the next question is from Dr. Tom Borowski. Dr. Tom?
Hey there, everybody. Dr. Amber, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm just going to share with everybody something that I shared with you on the chat before things went public.
Yeah.
Your notion of ethnoquilting, I think, is primo. And years ago, I suggested this as something that all students might do in the first year seminar experience at Alvernia, because very few people know about their own family history, etc. And I think it would be an edifying experience if they could get down with that, no matter what their race, gender, etc., etc. And I guess that's about it.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with that. And yes.
It's interesting. I think it connects up with what I like this terminology that you use, Amber, if I may, which is the talking back to invisibility, which is, I think, important not only for correcting historical narratives like you were talking, but I think that, to Dr. Tom's point, there are a lot of people who walk around this world that we live on without really having to bear the baggage or the concern or even think about their own location. So even if it's not the same kind of plumbing of depths that you have done in order to really understand an invisible history, the process of doing that brings to mind and may call to consciousness like an awareness that, that those histories and those locations and those situatednesses matter. And I'm hoping that the way that would work, hopefully, is that just to call attention to the fact that some lives are invisible, that's a watershed moment for some people. They don't know. And I think that that's the first step that hopefully can lessen the burden that you and Cynthia were talking about. I mean, other people in our society all have to actually recognize that there are people who have histories that are painful or that are invisible, that there are narratives and counter narratives that need to be spoken and space needs to be given to them. So that's my 2 cents on that. I don't want to, actually, there's another question. If you want to respond to that, I would love for you to, otherwise we can take another audience member.
I think you answered it well. I think it was a great response.
Well, I'm just pretty much vibing on you. So, I give you that credit. So it's Dr. Hayes, Dr. Josh Hayes.
Oh, thank you, Janae. And thank you, Dr. Pabon. I'm really intrigued by this metaphor. I want to echo Dr. Borowski about ethnoquilting. As a student of philosophy and someone who really studies global philosophy, I've spent a lot of time studying the art of weaving. And, that weaving is a very powerful metaphor globally. Someone who, my background is actually in ancient philosophy, and there's a whole political history that comes with weaving, right? As a symbol of democracy. So I'm really interested in learning about what the political import of quilting is. I mean, I know you have, I'm assuming the personal is the political here. And I'm assuming there must be a personal history for you about quilting, right? And I'm just interested in trying to bring that personal that personal story you have about quilting to sort of the political frame of it, because I think it's just so intriguing and fascinating, this metaphor of ethno-quilting. And I just, you said you were the one that you really kind of, you came up with this term. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Wow, that was a beautiful compliment, and I deeply appreciate your words. And so, I mean, and there's some folks that are here that know me, and they know that I got a story for everything. So you ask me a question, I tell you, this is my life, is stories. So absolutely. This is something that I'm still trying to get to the bottom of. This is a total sidebar, but I just have to announce this because we're talking personal and we're talking family. So my baby brother just had a baby, and I'm so excited about that because we're a small family, and I've been trying to ask my mom about our quilts. So yes, do we have a stack of quilts in our house? Absolutely. Were they tattered and ragged, right? For sure. So I have, in this process of engaging this research, I have looked at and examined some of the work that Butler has published around different traditions of quilt making, because they're depending on the region that you're from, those patterns look different, right? So again, this is like so preliminary, but I remember, so when I saw some of the images that I've been looking at around these quilts and some of these patterns, and remembering the quilts that were in our house, I mean, I saw alignment like with a particular pattern. So I asked my mom about this. And so because my brother's having a baby, like the conversation has paused at this point, but we believe that a woman who was my grandmother Hazel Jean's best friend, Mrs. Adams, who was actually my babysitter, was the quilt maker who brought that tradition. So she also migrated from the South, and during the 1940s. So my grandmother had a business. She was a cosmetologist. So grew up around Black women all the time, and we were very close to Mrs. Adams. And so, sort of to answer your question, there's a piece there, but again, these are folks that are dead now, right? So I have to go and do some more excavation. But this is why there's a question in the chat that Carla asked that I'll actually, I can actually answer. So the elements like of critical ethnoquilting were collecting artifacts, right? Documenting oral stories. So I've been taking those oral stories and writing those oral stories for quite some time now, and re-asking the same stories again to see if one family member says the same thing that another family member says. And then conducting some specific interviews. So I did conduct an interview of my grandmother. My cousin conducted an interview of Charlie. So some of what I shared with you came from Charlie's mouth. So I still land that in place that work in life history work, because it is as she told the story and as she would want to tell the story. But I think the most sort of the game changer for me in this work was actually the archival data that I was able to retrieve through Ancestry, Ancestry DNA, and doing all of that, then I was able to actually see some of those records, census records, tax records, employment records. So that log rolling anecdote that I shared about Charlie, that's a new piece of data that just emerged. But it showed me that in 1939, she earned $560 something that year, pushing these logs up and down the river in Pine Bluffs. So that employer, you know, has those records of her being an employee. So, I mean, this data like continues to unfold, and I'm like so thankful to the Smithsonian for releasing some of these records and the Freedmen's Bureau, and releasing some of these records from the Freedmen's Bureau, because it has enabled me to like triangulate in ways that otherwise, you know, we could have the oral story, and I have tons of artifacts and photographs. The quilts have been damaged, so those are lost. But to be able to have on paper, right, and to even get the alerts on my phone that here's more parts to your story. I mean, that is going back to finding your people, and it is hard to convey the level of affirmation, empowerment, and like intense like emotional overload to like finally understand, like to finally see like this big picture. And I guess, I mean, that's sort of my sort of long way of answering. So I still have to do some searching around this quilting. And once this baby's a little bit bigger, then I can go back and answer some of those questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the next question comes from Dr. Little.
I know Dr. Little.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you for, allowing us to, listen to your story and be a part of that story. I really value it. And also thank you for continuing to challenge my growth, as an educator and scholar. I appreciate that because I have notes even in this, in this talk here. But my question is kind of expanding on what everybody's talking about here is, how do you see, in typical education courses, we do take these like life history and to go back, but ethnoquilting is so much deeper. So I have like two kind of a tiered question here.
Okay, we got to know, this has to be in office hours now, Dr. Little. No more office hours.
I will say this, we can certainly go over a little bit, but we're probably maybe thinking of another 15 minutes or so.
Okay.
Of time, so just letting you know.
I'm just messing with Dr. Little. She has all my time. Go ahead.
Thank you. So how do you see, the application of ethnoquilting, not only for students, at the collegiate level, graduate and undergraduate, but also, in the secondary level, I see value for my students. And then the second tier to that question is, how do you envision it in graduate and undergraduate classrooms for educators, which are predominantly white, in understanding this?
Yes, I'm gonna answer the second part of your question first. So I think, we need to be, for those of us who are teacher educators in particular, we need to be really examining our syllabi and the text that we assign. I mentioned my own practice of making adjustments to the reading to diversify my students' experiences with text by scholars that they would otherwise overlook. For me, it was Susan Chase's ambiguous empowerment Susan E. Chase, Ambiguous Empowerment, and it is a life history of Black women superintendents. That text and Maggie and Me by Sherrick Hughes was another text that, you know, were specifically related to education that made me ask the question, and I'm just going to say it in African American language, like, why ain't nobody ever exposed me to these books before, right? Because sometimes I have to say it that way because that's the best way to say it. So I think that as a part of that coursework, like we think about our sort of our foundations classes, which we hope that colleges of education hold on to, right? We think about our sort of diversity classes that have a lot of work to do, like in one class. And we could do a lot. We could do a lot more educating, right? If we drew from life history research, right? If we engaged in that body of work. I mean, I think your study, right, is so important. Your work on Latina teachers. That needs to be a course text. So, I think that the responsibility, if we really care, if we say we care about diversity, right? We throw this term, we say we care about social justice, we say we care about equity, then we need to walk it like we talk it. And we have to be, we as faculty members have to change those syllabi, change the curriculum. And that's a provocative thing to say. And I know that's also a political process. But since you asked the question, and I'm not suggesting that I am engaged in that at all, because it's just it's a lot of work. But that's a call to action, you know, for those of us who are interested in broadening the landscape of the text that we teach.
It reminds me of the article, the one that was on colorblind teaching practices. And I actually had a question about that, because it seemed to me that, you were really struggling with, in teaching teachers how to teach, even, even to recognize their own colorblind kind of proclivities. And so I just kept thinking, this is something I know I can see in the chat. We are starving. We're starving for some of this content, for some strategies. And I mean, you just said it, walk it like, I love it. Walk it like we talk it. But I do wonder, are there any, you've got such a rich experience. And I do wonder if there are any strategies that are specific, because I was struck by the fact that you had been thinking through, and you had a wealth of strategies from your own teaching experience in teaching, well, really, in a predominantly white environment, students who are going to be teachers, and how to teach them how to teach that is not colorblind, that is actually sensitive to these differences and to others and to these stories. So any strategies that you can bring to us?
So is the question like sort of how might we engage in doing this work?
Yeah, so,
Okay.
So I think I put it in the chat, what are some strategies you have learned for introducing difficult or sensitive topics concerning race and social inequality to your students, or to get them to actually see this, and then to be able to actually enact, a different kind of pedagogy?
I have to give a lot of credit to actually, so I think there's a couple of, I referenced Cynthia and D'Angelo, Robin D'Angelo's work. And at the beginning, I believe, in terms of thinking about critical social justice. And I have to give credit to that text in particular, because I think it does, for me as a Black woman doing this work, I think it helps me to frame that we're about to go in, right? And we're about to be uncomfortable. And I'm going to ask you to sort of reserve, even as much as I tell stories, I'm going to ask you to reserve your anecdotes, right? And actually ground your perspectives in the text. So that the book is Everyone Really Equal, I think is like, is just a touchstone text that's fundamental to this work. But at the same time, I'll say that, none of this comes without risk. So a part of the strategy is being prepared for the backlash. Being prepared for the comments on your course evaluations. I came for this class and it's all about race, right? This is all we talk about is race, right? To be prepared to sort of sustain one's job, right? Because these are conversations that, as I demonstrate in Can You Say the R Word, like that entire, and shouts out to Vincent Bazile, my co-author on that piece, like those are conversations that people had no interest in entering into, even as these pre-service teachers were going into urban classrooms. And just the idea of reading The Bluest Eye as a touchstone text, right, was off limits. Lots of resistance around that. Or even imagining that like race and class and gender are gonna emerge in this book. So tread lightly. That's a strategy.
I mean, yeah.
I think framing the work that you do, and also shouts out to my good colleague, Dr. Mark Wolfmeyer. I think he's on the call too, or he was earlier, because also we need allies and accomplices in our work, right? So if we are taking a risk in unpacking and deconstructing racial inequality in our coursework, then whoever is taking that plunge, right, needs a colleague friend, right, a scholar friend who is going to have their back. In that process. So it is not without risk, is what I want to suggest.
I think I don't know, I know that you've been very, very focused and intensely focused on answering questions. If you were able to read, and hopefully we can give you some time at the end after we end so that you can read all these comments, that your statement just now has really hit home with a lot of people. And I think I'm just more and more struck by how lucky we are to have invited you to join us, Dr. Pavon, because I can see the comments, I can see the reactions to you from our students and from our faculty members, and you have really both inspired, touched, and given us so much food for thought, myself included. I'm revivified, if I may say so, to go in and to I can't even remember the phrase, but walk the talk.
Walk it like you talk it, like the
Walk it like that's it. I'll get it right. To walk it like you talk it. And I think that we need more of these conversations, these forthright discussions. We need more people to say, be ready to take the risk, and more people to take up that charge. I mean, one of our mantra is that we are teaching and producing students and young adults who are ethical leaders with moral courage. And there is another aspect of that, walk it like you talk it. This is what requires moral courage. And you have it, I'd say, in spades. So we are coming to the end of our time together. And I just want to take one last opportunity to thank you warmly and deeply on behalf of the Alvernia community, on behalf of the search program and our first year students who will be sharing this event and this experience and as they will take it back to their classroom, and it will be incorporated into it will be incorporated into their curriculum and the discussions, and will be food for thought for them. And so I want to thank you for this entire evening. And let our audience, you can even unmute and give Dr. Pavon a round of applause if you like, or just, here. Yay.
Thank you.
Yay!
Very good.
That's the best.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. It has been a real pleasure and so very educational and inspiring.
Thank you.
So this concludes our program for tonight. I think at this time, I'm going to have to maybe stay on with Scott for just a moment to make sure that we have everything correct. But thank you, audience members. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention and the wonderful discussion that just ensued. It was a real true model of what we can do together.
Thank you.